Welcome to this new episode of Historically Speaking. I'm your host, Michael Dwyer, and my guest today will be Julia Purdy, whose presentation is titled From Church Bells to Train Whistles, Rutland and the Ripleys, from 1837 to 1958. Julia Purdy.
Thank you.
Her mom, Jean Swain, had a long affiliation with the Rutland Historical Society, the Rutland Herald, and her stepdad, Howard Swain, was a former editor of the Rutland Herald. So with no further ado, let's go now to our guest, Julia Purdy, and her presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for having me here, because this is kind of a special little project I started in observance of the new marble bust that's outside the Rutland Library now of Julia Ripley Dorr. And I want to also thank Carolyn Raffley of the Rutland Historical Society very much for helping me sort through the material in order to gather it for this talk. So let's begin with what listeners already may know about. The bust outside the library that was written up as part of the Marble Trail, or the Sculpture Trail. Then we have Dorr Drive, we have Dorr Bridge, Ripley Road, and the many marble retaining walls and chunks of marble along Otter Creek. These provide the context for these features because they tell a story of Rutland's rise from a market village to an industrial center, and its story parallels the narratives actually of so many other American cities as the nation picked up steam in the period preceding and following the Civil War. We are fascinated with the places where people in the past lived, worked, raised families, their relationships, because the places contain stories that give us a sense of historical continuity and a sense of place, and the Ripley story is no different. So with that, this story begins with William Young Ripley. He was born in Middlebury. He had a commonplace upbringing. These are his children. But in 1820, at age 21, he caught the wave of progress and followed his brother to South Carolina, where he reinvented himself as a new man of business. The country was beginning its transformation into a shopkeeper as opposed to a farm-based economy. Others of his generation included Frederick Billings of Woodstock. Ripley moved back to Vermont, where he raised several children. These are the children, and the four that actually interest us start with the second girl in from the left. That is Julia Ripley, later Julia Ripley Dorr. And then the older boy over to the right, the taller boy with a hand up to his chin, is William Young Warren. Then next to him, the blondish boy is Edward Hastings, his brother. And then the little boy is Charles, who was the sort of the wayward child of the family. William Young Ripley's grandson, Thomas Emerson Ripley, published A Vermont Boyhood in 1937, a nostalgic but informative backward look at the daily life of the Ripleys in Rutland. And that book is available to go on loan and also in the Vermont room at the library. So we're dealing with these four particular children of William Young Ripley. Julia Caroline Ripley moved into Rutland with her husband, Seneca Dorr, in 1847 to be near her father, who at that point had moved here. Her bust stands outside the Rutland Library, and the River Street Bridge and Dorr Drive are named for the Dorrs. Like most of her siblings, she stood out in the community. She helped to found the library and served as its first board president. She was active in the New England literary world with her poetry and was a promoter of broad-based education for women. Seneca Dorr, her husband, was another new man of business, a banker, a lawyer, gentleman farmer, dabbler in politics, who, like so many others, divided his time between Vermont and New York City. So Julia Ripley Dorr, Rutland's lady poet. When Seneca Dorr and Julia moved into Rutland, Seneca built this house, the Maples. This is a view across Otter Creek from center Rutland. The view exists no more because it's all in behind the waste treatment plant and every other thing. You cannot get to it. But you can see right across Otter Creek, there's this quite nice, comfortable home on the knoll. And off to the far left is the door-covered bridge, which led into the Rutland Village.
Mm-hmm. Knowing that there are later photographs of this, you can see the wonderful later Victorian additions to this house, such as the porches.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So notice the bareness of the land, too. Her poems describe open pastures and scenes from that vantage point that are impossible to get today without cutting down trees. This is a postcard from 1904, 9 years before her death. The gardens were quite lush. At one point, that whole slope in front of the house was planted to wildflowers and perennials. That's the creek road passing by, renamed Dorr Drive, which goes out to the old site of the college and also the Ripley Bridge. Behind the house was a barn, half an acre of gardens, an arbor, a small apple orchard, a patch of woods, rocky cow pastures. And long after the Dorrs were gone, private owners acquired it, and eventually it was bought by a religious institution. The porches were taken off, and the gardens behind the house are now a vast parking lot. I think an aside that I'm trying to point out too is the importance of preserving these places of Rutland's and Vermont's historical past. Now this picture shows the entire Ripley clan. Julia is seated more or less in the middle, the white-haired lady with a little girl sitting in front of her. But off to the left are her two boys who were officers in the Union Army and saw action in the Civil War. So to the left, far left, we see William Young Warren Ripley, and then next to him is Edward Hastings Ripley. William Y.W. commanded the 1st Vermont Volunteers and later the 1st U.S. Sharpshooters. He earned the Medal of Honor, and after the war he returned to Rutland and took co-ownership of Ripley's Sons Marble Works. He was president of the Bank of Rutland, and he loved hunting and fishing more than anything else. His brother, Edward Hastings Ripley, had the distinction of being Brevet Brigadier General, leading the capture of Richmond, Virginia. After the war, he divided his residency between Rutland and New York City. He invested in a railroad and a steamship line, which everybody was doing back then. He became president of the Marble Savings Bank, and he served in the State House representing Mendon. So the two gentlemen off to the left are Julia's actually half-brothers because he had remarried. Now, where were we in terms of the land, where all of these things were taking place? This is the famous New York Survey of Social Borough, when New York tried to claim the New Hampshire grants for itself. This was done pre-Revolutionary War. You can see the twisting route of Otter Creek above it is all empty, nothing there. So it forms the boundary of that blank space. And coming in from the right, the upper right, you've got East Creek. So right where East Creek joins Otter Creek is the beginning of center Rutland, and everything on the north bank, as you see, is empty. This survey showed nothing there, although it was outlining plots for future ownership south of Otter Creek. It does show where the Clarendon River comes in off to the left, and then the last little marker sort of above the bend is the future Sutherland Falls in Proctor. So this was before a lot of people even were about to move in here. Center Rutland here, this map, unfortunately I don't have a date, but if you look carefully, you'll see some familiar features, right? You see Otter Creek going through the middle. You see that railroad line cutting through where the trains still go through every single day. It diverges, the northern branch heads up through Proctor. The lower branch heads out towards Castleton. And you can see the road that follows it along the top above the railroad, which was then Main Street. If you look carefully at the intersection of Main Street, just before that railroad overpass, is the residence of William Young Ripley and a grocery store that apparently he owned. You'll see farther, a little moving to the east, you'll see Pine Hill Cemetery, which was a precursor for Evergreen. And then you'll see a number of Ripley Sons labels that show where they had their whole marble works, which developed and developed. Now, if you kind of look at Otter Creek again, where it dips a little bit and then continues on, the crossing for Otter Creek, in this case, it happens to be the Ripley Bridge. There were marble trimming shops there. That big empty space right at above the bend of the river, between the bend and the railroad track, which was the old Rutland Plywood Factory, that was all Ripley. It was a huge building where they finished marble. And then on either side of the road, the Ripleys had scattered offices and facilities. So the Ripleys basically, in effect, held down the whole eastern part of Center Rutland, basically from Evergreen Cemetery, or the Ripley Bridge, all the way out to the railroad overpass.
This may have come from Beer's Atlas in 1869. It looks like it.
It looks like the typeface, doesn't it?
Yes.
The print, yeah. I think it probably does. 1869, it's the date that would fit, okay? So those are some familiar landmarks that we can see there. Now this is another view a little bit later. It has the Otter Creek was going to be our point of reference, and also the railroad line going through. So Evergreen Cemetery is now what it turned into, nice and green up there. And then if you look to the left of Evergreen Cemetery, you can see another Ripley property, which now belongs to Mrs. William Young Ripley, Jane Hastings Ripley. And that house is shown right along Main Street there. You'll see it's quite a swath of frontage there, and it goes way, way back. Well, I haven't verified it, but I believe that probably the Ripleys just donated that back portion for the lower parts of Evergreen Cemetery. And there you have East Proctor Road heading out, as usual. Now, if you look a little bit toward the east and south of Main Street, that other little green cemetery patch there, that's the cemetery that's right there. Right next to it was a Methodist chapel, which the Ripleys attended. That Methodist chapel was taken down, and the town hall for Rutland Town is in its spot. And the parsonage, as you're moving farther east along Main Street or West Street, the parsonage was right on the corner where the furniture store is now. So you can really kind of see how the land evolved in the terms of its occupations. Then we've got a close-up, more of a close-up of that really shows you Mrs. W.Y. Ripley, the Ripley Sons facilities everywhere, all over the place. Now we've got Ripley Sons with a building right where the old Rutland plywood was. And right next to it is Vermont Marble. In 1880, the Ripleys sold their marble operation to Redfield Proctor at Vermont Marble. So William Young Ripley's house in Center Rutland is still there. It was built in 1837. You notice the porches and the grounds that contained a fountain that you can see on the right side there. At that time, he owned 2 marble mills, a grist mill, a cabinet factory, and a large farm, according to his grandson that wrote the memoir. By 1848, William Young had a huge marble finishing shop, as I mentioned, where the Rutland plywood plant was. And by 1884, the Ripley holdings included both sides of the road. Now this is a shot of the house, and it's labeled for the Vermont Company Club, Marble Company Club. And what that was at some point they turned the house over to use as a club for the working men of the quarries and the factories. Okay.
Interesting architectural feature that probably came from the Dutch who first settled New York
Yes.
in those side features that kind of mimics the way that firewalls used to be erected between houses in the city, and they just incorporated that architectural element to give the building an even older look than what it was.
Well, it is a feature of Dutch architecture. It's called parapet walls.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you've got a lot of federal influence. This was built in 1835,
Mm-hmm.
and it's brick. Okay, so you've got some federal influence in the elliptical recesses over the windows and the little trim along the eaves. It's not a large house. It's not sumptuous. It's certainly comfortable. And the property behind it, the yards had a fountain and places to play and a greenhouse and different things. So in 1852, that was President Edwards' map. 1852, we're moving into Rutland Village, called the Village. Rutland was not a city yet. And William Ripley, young Ripley, the paterfamilias, moved his family into Rutland Village. And according to the grandson, they had a place, they settled between Cottage Place. West Street ran along the front, Cottage Place ran along the west, the back fence ran along the north, and to the east there was a church. Now in 1852, according to this, Johnson was the only house that faced right onto West Street. Now maybe either Ripley's rented it to Johnson or they bought it from Johnson, but you see there's nothing left there. And in the next slide, I think we'll see a little bit more about this. But there was a house there that the Ripleys lived in. In fact, Thomas Emerson Ripley was born in that house. Scott's map of 1854 shows us a little bit more. Here we have Johnson, there we have Thomas. And there we have a schoolhouse immediately to the right of Johnson's house. The kids went to school at that schoolhouse. And that's, you'll see, Whale Street ends right at West Street. Church Street has not been built yet. That schoolhouse sits on the spot where Longfellow School is now. And now I find that, you know, when you're looking at towns throughout Vermont, the same function or the same facility seems to sit in the same spot, even though years have passed and different owners have moved in and whatever. So at some point, he had this little green house, or a little white house with green shutters. They had a croquet lawn, a sliding place, trapeze and swings and rings. They kept Morgan horses. They had a dog yard with kennels, quite a swath that went all the way back to William Street, today's William Street. Trinity is actually the second church building on that parcel. The first one was the new Episcopal Methodist Church built on land donated by Brother Ripley. So from Johnson to where the schoolhouse is now, that was evidently Ripley property. So I'm not sure how Johnson comes into it, but there he is. Edson Alley, there was a big lumber yard where the kids always used to go and get in trouble and write graffiti and read dirty words in the dictionary and stuff like that. So the core of Rutland was really highly industrial, as you can kind of see from that. So here's the house. And a note that was added by someone at the Historical Society said, WYW, William Young Warren Ripley House, was moved to 62 East Washington Street from Cottage and West Streets. So basically, they had to go over the hill. That must have been an arduous move. And that house, I did go by it. If you mentally erase this little portico here, you have the outlines of a Greek Revival period house. And 1854 matches the date about for that time period. So there again, that's a mystery that, you know, we could look into and solve a little bit. But that was the little white house with green shutters that Thomas Emerson Ripley was born into. Now, as far as General Edward Hastings Ripley, he kind of moved out of town. He moved up into Mendon, and this is the Mendon House. And this house may have started out as a tavern, a stand where you would refresh yourselves and maybe switch teams before you went over the arduous mountain there. Anyway, this house sat right on the spot where Sugar and Spice is now. And in 1958, the state and the feds completely realigned that corner of Route 4 to facilitate people to get up onto the mountain where Killington Resort was in the planning stages. And so the road was widened, the curve was flattened out very intentionally, and that house was commandeered. The Ripleys themselves didn't own it, but a Ripley descendant did own it and was renting it out. So the tenants were vacationing at Lake Dunmore. They got a notice, you got to move out of this house. They moved out of the house. And I don't know whether the house was burned down or torn down, but the only thing remaining is the sugar house that's up there, and that is the original sugar shack up there. Now, one other interesting feature, if you go up there, if you walk to the back of that, parking area and look at this huge ledge that's sticking out of the hillside, you'll notice that that is the burial site of General Edward's warhorse, Old John. He was a Morgan, and he's buried there, and his memorial is carved into the side of that ledge.
What I am impressed with are all the awnings, because even by then, people sought a bit of altitude for summer coolness. So
Yeah.
that was a perfect place for it. And the other
Exactly.
thing behind that would be Meadow Lake Drive. And the question that everybody asks, where's the lake? So the topography up there between the Rutland Town line and the Mendon line, that's changed a lot over time.
Yes, it is. It has. And a lot of that, I think, has to do with Mendon Brook.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly the topography changed a little bit with Tropical Storm Irene. But if you look to the right of the house, you'll see kind of a leveling out place that suggests a road going through there. They would have had to cross Mendon Brook somehow. I'm not sure how they would have done that. But you can kind of see up where, what's it called? Some of those, like Sherwood Drive and some of those suburban
Right,
roads
developments,
go up the
yep,
hill.
yep.
Yeah, you can kind of see that suggestion there. And then this is a view of the house in the wintertime. The awnings are down. And so that's another thing I think for people to bear in mind is that these big projects and also private owners, if they don't understand what's there and if they don't understand the importance of those places to local people who know the traditions and know the lay of the land. It might be where we start losing some of these things, like with the Door House on Door Drive, and with this, which in 1958, probably who cares? You know, you're putting a big road through. It's a whole new era moving into Rutland. Now there is a historic plaque there, but there wasn't for a long time, and the Mendon Historical Society has been tirelessly trying to convey the importance of that one little stretch of road. That road wiped out Mendon, basically Mendon Center. So people going through it now who don't know about it have no idea what was there. So that's my talk. I hope I didn't go too fast, but...
No, this has really been delightful. It certainly gives us an appreciation of the imprint on this family and their homes and the art. And I think we're very fortunate to have what remains. And maybe at some point, this may have been done in the past, we could have a Ripley Trail and actually with a little tour bus go from place to place. One thing, given your personal connection with the Rutland Herald, you notice in one of those early maps of West Street, to the right of where the Johnsons lived, that's where the Rutland Herald was at that time. And I think that's a really significant thing, that we're fortunate to be still having one of the oldest small town newspapers in the country. And I bet if we were to look back, we could look in the Rutland Herald archives to see some of the contemporary reporting on some of these.
Definitely. I did research into the Rutland Herald back issues, which are available, by the way, for free through the Rutland Historical Society, to track down what exactly happened up there in Mendon and the planning that went into it and the actions that happened. So that's available. And I'm glad to see that the old Rutland Herald office, which has seen so much over the years on Wales Street, you know, the facades being preserved and being honored that way. So, yeah, we do value the past, and I think people coming in from newer parts of the country notice that, and they have expressed appreciation to me anyway about that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being our guest today, and I hope you'll come back with other things that we talked about.
Well, I hope I can.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.